Okay, so in this video tutorial, we're going to be retouching a still life, and we're going to be removing wrinkles from this gray fabric. Any imperfections, anything that needs to be removed that's distracting to the image. We are also going to open this image with the raw processor, and we are going to adjust for temperature. So this is what we're going to start with first. We're going to first adjust the image. Once we've done that, then we're going to go in and use the cloning tool to remove imperfections from the fabric. After we do that, we are going to blur the image, and we are going to use a layer mask. We're going to reduce the opacity of the blur, use a layer mask, and then go in and use the gradient tool so that we are creating this depth of field where the pleats in the background are out of focus, but the fabric in the front where the books are is a little more sharp. But first we're going to start with our raw processor, and we're going to adjust the temperature. We're going to make maybe the image a little more red, but not too much. So if I double click on this little sliding triangle shape here, it'll put it back to the original setting. So I'm going to move it up just slightly, and then I'm going to check my tint. I don't want it to be green. I want it to be more of a grayish tone, so I'm going to move it to the right. Now I'm going to check my exposure. If we look at this histogram, we've got a good exposure. There might be an area that needs to be recovered a little bit, so we'll go ahead and slide that across and look to see if there's a change. And I did notice that there's a little more detail in the book. Now if we come over here to the exposure, we don't want to lighten it too much. We want to keep the detail. So let's keep it right about there. We don't probably need to adjust any fill light because it gets too bright. So bring that back down. Blacks, we don't want to overdo it because then we lose a lot of detail. So maybe we'll move it up slightly, just make it a little bit darker where the blacks are. We want them nice and black. Now if we put too much brightness, then it lightens it up again. So we'll double click on the little triangle shape, move it back to where it was originally. We could move it up slightly, give it a little bit of contrast. Let's go Control Plus. We are going to zoom in, and we're going to check our clarity. We do want to sharpen it up just slightly. Okay, in Control Minus, we don't want to overdo it though. On the clarity, add a little bit of vibrance and maybe a little bit of saturation. Look what happens if I oversaturate. It gets too red. So double click on my little triangle shape, bring it back to the original setting, add a little bit of saturation. Now I'm going to come over here to my little detail icon, which looks like a green tree, a little green triangle shape. I'm going to click on that. It's going to bring me to the sharpening and noise reduction. I'm going to go to Control Plus, and I'm going to sharpen the image a little bit. Right now I've moved it up to 150, and I really didn't notice much of a change. So that means that we probably sharpened as much as we could when we adjusted the clarity. I'm going to look and see if I need to do any noise reduction. And when I slide it over, nothing changes, so that means that we don't really have any more noise reduction that we can do on this image. Now I'm going to click on Open Image, and I'm going to open the image in Photoshop. Great. So now I want to duplicate my background layer. I never want to work on the original image. So I'm going to duplicate the layer. I'm going to call it my working image. And say OK. And I'm going to go Control plus, and I'm going to zoom in, and I'm going to move my navigator to the left corner of my image. I'm going to use my cloning tool on my vertical toolbar. It looks like a stamping tool. So I'm going to click on that, and I am going to Alt click, and I'm going to remove any little imperfections. I'm also going to lower my opacity down to 50% on my cloning tool so that I have more control. What I'm going to remove is imperfections and anything that really stands out, like a dark wrinkle. And this can take some time. You're going to want to do this for a while. And as I do this, I am constantly alt-clicking, constantly changing the position of where I'm cloning so that I do not create a cloning pattern. Do not want to create a cloning pattern that looks really bad. To see like the same clone pattern over and over again. We don't want to do that. So all I'm doing is constantly left clicking and constantly pushing the alt to clone my fabric. So I'm going to back out and look at what I've done so far. If I could Control minus, I can turn my working image off and look at those dark wrinkles that are on the original background layer. If I turn my working image back on again, we can see that many of them are gone. I go Control plus minus, and I'm going to crop in again, and I'm going to continue to Alt left click. Okay. Alright, now I'm going to move. I'm going to look at my book here. It looks like that is fine. I'm going to move to the center area. The book is mostly out of focus because that's not where the focus was on this image. It was on the doll back here. That's where it's mostly sharp, or on the cup here. It's mostly sharp there. So I'm going to move to the right side and look and see if there's any wrinkles that I want to retouch. There's a few darker ones that I definitely want to get rid of here. Just soften this up a little bit. So now I'm going to back out Control minus, and looks like right here I could definitely retouch some of that dark fabric there. So if I turn my working image off, we can see the difference here. Now I'm going to move, and I'm looking at my background, and I can see some fabric areas in the back here that need a little bit of retouching. What's nice about the fabric, it's kind of spotted, and so the cloning doesn't have to be totally perfect. Now I'm going to crop in on my cup, see if there's anything I need to clone on the cup. Looks good on the ticket, looks good on the books, the doll, a little bit of white on the doll fabric I want to clone. Alright, Control minus, I'm going to zoom out. Now I'm ready to, so if we turn the working image off, we can just look at that again and just look at the difference between them. And the cloning definitely did a nice job on that. So now I'm going to duplicate that layer, and I'm going to call this blur effect. My eyes are going blurry. Blur effect, okay. And I'm going to add a filter effect by coming up to Filter, Blur. And I'm going to either do a Gaussian blur, a motion blur, or a surface blur. So let's try going with the Gaussian blur. And I'm going to really blur it out so that everything is blurred. And that's fine because I'm going to add well, first of all, I'm going to reduce the opacity on the blur, okay? So I say okay, and I let my computer think. Now I come over here to my opacity, and I want to lower it down, but what I want to look at right now is the background. I want my background to be really soft, but also I want it to look natural. So if we were taking into consideration depth of field, we would have a blurry background if we had a shallow depth of field, and the front could be a little bit blurry because our focus is on the cup, which is in the center. So the front can be blurry and the back can be blurry. But for right now, I'm just going to double check for the background. And I want it to be blurry, but I want it to be blurry enough to make the fabric look soft and reduce the amount of wrinkles that are in the fabric. So I'm probably going to leave it like right about 60%. Now I'm going to go ahead and add my my layer mask. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to click on my gradient tool on the toolbar. I'm going to make sure that I am clicking on my linear gradient tool, and I'm going to adjust my opacity down to like 40%, and I'm going to drag my gradient tool from the bottom to the top. Alright, and what I'm starting to do is I'm starting to remove the blur off at the bottom while leaving the background fabric still soft. I'm going to do a couple more times. And what's happening is we're starting to see a little bit of a gray tone on our layer mask. Okay, and now I'm going to make sure I'm clicked in my layer mask, and I'm going to come over here and grab a soft brush. A nice soft brush, probably like a small soft brush, like around maybe 75, maybe a little bigger. And I'm going to put my opacity to like about 50% on my brush, and I'm going to remove the soft blur off of my person, who is my little doll here. Now I want to make sure that my brush only stays on the doll. Okay. And what we're doing is we're taking the extra blur that we added, we're taking it off the doll because we don't need to make the doll any more blurry than it already was originally. So we want the doll to be a little bit sharper, but we want to be very careful that we don't take the blur off of the background. So you want to stay only inside of the doll and cup area. Do not go out of the parameter of the doll or the cup area. You will start to see kind of a dark silhouette starting to form on the layer mask. I'm going to go Control Plus, and I'm just going to zoom in really close so that I can double check to make sure that I'm not accidentally taking blur off of the background. So I'm just going carefully around the edge of the doll. And I can go a little faster in the center area, going careful around the edge of the doll. Go a little bit faster in the center area. And And starting to form a silhouette. I'm going to up my opacity a little bit more just to make this go a little faster. Okay, and I'm going to bring my navigator down a little bit, and I want to take the softness completely off the cup, because the cup is the sharpest part of the image, and this is the area that I want the focus to go to, the attention to go to. And so we want to take off the blur effects from the cup and from the ticket. Make sure there's no more blur on here, because these are the sharpest parts of the image. So we have a shallow depth of field, so the front of the image is out of focus. The center, where the cup and the ticket are sharp, and the doll's a little bit out of focus, and then the background is really out of focus. So we're creating that depth of field. And I'm taking the blur off of the book. We don't need to add any more blur to the book. It's pretty good. I'm actually going to go with a little bit bigger brush so I can do this a little faster. And I definitely don't need to make the book any more blurrier than it is, because it's already a little bit out of focus from when it was photographed. But I'm still keeping the blur on the background because it helps to soften the fabric. So we can definitely see that this is starting to look like a silhouette of the books, the dolls, the cup, the concert ticket, all of that. Alright, so let's go Control minus and we'll back out. And I'm going to double check the edges on here just to make sure that I didn't accidentally take the blur off the background. I'm just going to go around with the objects here, double check the edges of the blur on the background. Looks like I might have taken a little bit of the softness off the background right here, so I'm going to put it back in by reversing my foreground and background, putting the white over the black, and making sure that I have the soft focus here. Okay. Control minus, I'm just going to back out now, and I'm thinking I might up the opacity a little bit on my background blur. Okay, so looks pretty good. So now I'm going to add my last feature, which is to add a vignette. But before I do that, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to pick my palette color. And I think I'm going to pick kind of a dark gray color. So let's come over here and pick kind of a dark gray. Okay. And now I'm going to go to my Add, Create New Adjustment Layer and go to Solid Color. And it will automatically go to the color I selected from my palette right here. I say OK. And now I'm going to go in and make sure I click on my layer mask, choose a nice soft brush, 2400 in size. My opacity I want to put down to about 40%. And I'm going to slowly but surely start to remove the Create New Fill Adjustment layer, the solid color that I added of this very kind of dark gray color. And I'm going to leave the gray color around the edges so it starts to form kind of like an oval shape. When you have a vertical shot like this, it starts to form a bit of an oval shape in our layer mask with the edges grayed out, and we have the corners and the bottom corners kind of grayed out. In the center, we've removed all of the gray. If I turn that off, you can see the difference. It helps to kind of just give it a nice finished look. And then once you do this, you're ready to save it. You're going to save it in your U drive. You're going to call it Still Life 1 or Still Life 2, depending upon how many images you've done so far. So you will call it Still Life 1 underscore your first initial last name, and again you're going to save it in your U drive in the Still Life folder.